Hey guys, hope everyone's doing well. Welcome back to the channel. It's me, Rocco, and today we're going to be doing an album that I absolutely just love. I absolutely adore this album, Headhunters by Herbie Hancock, and the band Headhunters. This album here, guys, when I do reviews like this, uh, you know, the inner fanboy within comes out because I really do consider this a perfect album. And I guess you're thinking like, well, what's the point of reviewing perfect albums? It's not really to review it per se. It's just to kind of pour out my love and affection for it and to turn people onto it. So that's kind of the purpose of when I review these hardcore masterpieces. And often I do review albums that I absolutely love because let's face it, guys, it's a lot more fun to be positive and to promote albums that you have a passion for than to talk about subpar albums and turn people away from them. So if you guys want that, go on like a fucking site like Sputnik Music or Prague Archives, and you'll see the ratings and general consensus. But on my channel, I try to keep things positive. So yeah, after that little preamble there, let's talk a little bit about Headhunters. This album here is considered a jazz fusion classic from 1973, so a few years into the whole jazz fusion movement. But this album here is absolutely visionary, absolutely unique. It was just the first album that really combined jazz and funk on equal footing. In the past, a lot of jazz fusion bands did add funk into their sound, but this one here, damn, it brought it right into the forefront, and it's just a perfect fusion of that. So a very interesting album, a very commercially successful album as well. It went platinum right away, and I think it's to this day one of the best-selling jazz albums of all time, and I could totally see why. I mean, first of all, funk music is just, it appeals to the masses. Everyone loves a nice funky groove every once in a while, and it's just not very demanding on the listener, very not easy listening in the sense of elevator music, but something that I really think that everyone could get into. But not only that, it has fantastic playing, fantastic melodies that just stick in your head, and but it doesn't sacrifice the complexities of jazz. I mean, don't get me wrong. Just because this album was commercially successful and appealed to the masses does not mean that these guys sold out. I mean, this album here is just as intricate as ever. The playing is fantastic. It has sax solos, amazing keyboard solos from Herbie Hancock, the man himself. And I love how the album, as it goes on, it just gets progressively more and more experimental and jazzy, if you want to put it that way. So for that reason, this album here is really cited as an album to start off with if you want to get into jazz, because it starts off very, very funky, where jazz and funk are kind of on the same level. But then as the album progresses, the balance shifts more and more towards jazz, just easing you into it. And then by side two, we're in full-on jazz mode. Still a lot of those funk elements, but the jazz definitely takes dominance there. So I just love the album. It's a perfect kind of gateway drug if you want to get into jazz. And I can't recommend it enough. It's just fantastic. And I mean, Herbie Hancock, what can you say about the guy? He was one of the great musical geniuses, one of the greatest keys players who ever existed, right up there with Chick Corea and, plenty of others. But man, in the 70s, those two were just on a whole other level. And I might actually prefer Herbie Hancock. I don't know. It's a toss-up. They were both fucking amazing. But he was a visionary. And this guy here, he was one of those musicians that never stagnated. He always changed up his sound, always wanted to try new things. Kind of like Miles Davis in that sense, who, ironically enough, he was part of Miles Davis' band, as well as many of the other premier jazz fusion groups. A lot of their members started off with Miles Davis. But yeah, that spirit of discovery and experimentation, just a core part of Herbie Hancock, and he just seems like such a genuine person as well. So what's not to love about it? And this is another one of those albums that I'm just getting into this year. Believe it or not, I haven't heard this album until, I think, maybe it was March when I first heard it. And I've been listening to it nonstop since then. Me and my friend listened to it one night, and it just enveloped me, and I just got sucked into the album. And since then, I've just been digesting all these jazz fusion albums, and it's just one of the greatest genres ever. But this one here, perfect album to get into. But even if you're a seasoned jazz fusion fan, you're going to love it because there's a lot of complexities that lie under the surface and are on top of the surface as well. I mean, there's some parts that are unashamedly improvisational and complex, but it's not just constant throughout the whole album. And I'll never forget the first time I heard anything off this thing. I was watching weird movies with that same friend I was talking about, and the intro of Watermelon Man from this album came on, and we're all like, oh my god, what the fuck's that? Because it just sounded so weird and otherworldly, and we hadn't heard anything like that up to this point. Well, correction. And he had already heard the album, so he filled us in. He's like, oh, yeah, it's Herbie Hancock. And one of my other friends is a jazz bass player, and he recognized the name as well. So that kind of piqued my interest. But I think a whole year went by at least before we actually listened to the album from start to finish. And it just blew me away. It's just such a great fucking album. So I don't know what else to say, guys. So that's the intro to the video. Now let's talk about the history behind the making of Headhunters and how Herbie Hancock assembled this incredible band and made this essentially flawless album. All right, guys, so now we're talking about the history behind Headhunters. And this album here was really, a fresh chapter for Herbie Hancock. This was really a point in his career where he wanted to make a move, a seismic change in his sound, and again, get a little bit more down to earth, a little bit more accessible. Because up to this point, I mean, holy shit, look at this guy's discography. He had really done it all. He was 33 years old at this point in 1973, and basically from 1960 onwards, this guy was just constantly innovating. He performed in some of the most seminal jazz and jazz fusion bands of all time, and he had just been contributing to jazz, really a true pioneer, a true trailblazer, really doing all kinds of different things, pushing the boundaries. And he felt that at this point in his career, there was nowhere else to go in terms of the crazy experimentation. So he decided to tone it down a notch and recruit a new band. But I think before we get into that, let me give you guys a little bit of a background behind Herbie Hancock and why he made this decision. Because I find that it's really important to talk about this before we get into the specifics behind this album. So one thing you guys got to realize about Herbie was that this guy was a prodigy. He was a child prodigy. He was already playing in youth, in like a youth symphony with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra when he was like 11 years old. He was classically trained and really just born as a musical genius. So naturally, he was getting a lot of people's attention. He went to university, studied music and electrical engineering. I don't know how that makes sense, but anyway. And by 1962, he actually released a solo album, which was very well received. And a little someone named Miles Davis, only the greatest jazz musician of all time, arguably, he took notice of Herbie Hancock. And at that point, he himself was assembling a new band of young musicians to really push the sound of jazz forward. And this became known as Miles Davis's second great quintet. And he personally sought out Herbie Hancock, who he welcomed with open arms. And over the course of the next, I want to say 6 years, the Miles Davis second quintet really pushed the boundaries of jazz. And again, I'm no expert on this. This is just based on documentaries I've seen and things I've read. But yeah, the albums they made together were just groundbreaking and phenomenal. But at this point in 1968, Miles Davis, we all know he was trying to get a little bit into the jazz fusion territory, basically creating that entire genre along with Frank Zappa, and demanding that his band start playing electric instruments. So a lot of the members of the band, including Herbie Hancock, who had been, again, classically trained to be playing acoustic piano his entire life, he was kind of reluctant to do that. And Ron Carter, the bass player, was having none of that shit, so he left the band. Herbie Hancock reluctantly stayed and started playing the electric instruments. And over time, he started warming up to them. But ultimately, he ended up leaving Miles Davis's band before they recorded the groundbreaking Bitches Brew, which is arguably like the first or, one of the first jazz fusion albums of all time. And In a Silent Way as well, which preceded it. So Herbie Hancock went off, did his own thing. Throughout the 60s, although he'd been in Miles Davis' band, he had recorded a lot of solo albums, soundtracks, fucking commercials, all kinds of stuff. I mean, this guy was prolific as fuck. And following the departure from Miles Davis, he did a few projects, but nothing really, groundbreaking or original for that matter. But then all that changed in 1971, where he formed the Mwandishi Band. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And he proceeded to release 3 of the most experimental, groundbreaking jazz fusion albums of all time. I mean, really spacey, really heavy stuff. Not heavy in terms of heavy metal riffs or anything like that, but very demanding on the listener. And it was a trilogy of albums. And the band he had was amazing at that time. He had Benny Maupin, who had previously been in Miles Davis's band during the Bitches Brew sessions. Fantastic reed player, by the way. And at this point, with these 3 Mwandishi albums, Herbie Hancock was fully enveloped in the electric instruments. Once he heard Bitches Brew and what Miles Davis was doing after he left, that was it for him. He fully embraced the electronic soundscapes that were going on at the time in Miles Davis's band. And yeah, so those three albums there, absolutely amazing. I've only heard the second one, Crossings, which is just a life-changing album for me, guys. I mean, that album there is just, wow. That is just an experience in and of itself, similar to Bitches Brew. But the point was, what I'm trying to get at is that Herbie Hancock was really getting tired of all the experimentation. I mean, they had three full-length albums, each of them only consisting of 3 songs, usually between the 10 and 25-minute range, which is absolutely insane. And he felt that he couldn't really push the boundaries any further with this avant-garde experimental music. So that's when he decided in 1973 to get together a new band called the Headhunters. And he purposefully sought out young musicians, musicians that weren't really well established in jazz, because he wanted to create something fresh, something new and exciting. And I guess it's kind of ironic because those past few albums were so fresh and exciting and experimental. But I guess after such an exhausting trilogy, he knew he had to do something different. And really, if you think about it, it's kind of like history repeating itself. Because when Herbie Hancock was recruited to Miles Davis's second great quintet, that's what Miles Davis was going for. He was going for young musicians that really weren't well established, because he needed some new blood into jazz. And he knew that, hiring old-ass musicians was just going to be a regurgitation of the past. Because if you look at Miles Davis's quintet, you'll notice Herbie Hancock. He was, 23 at the time. Tony Williams, the drummer, was about, I think, like 18 or 17, which is insane. So really, Herbie Hancock must have had inspiration from Miles Davis in that sense. So really, the master teaching the student, who has now become the master and recruiting and assembling his own band, which is kind of like the circle of life in music, I guess, and especially jazz, which really does seem to be like patriarchal. Like people, again, a lot of people learned from Miles Davis. A lot of those jazz fusion bands really sprung forth from the whole late 60s Miles Davis experience, if you want to call it that. But yeah, so he recruited a bunch of new musicians. If you look at their birth dates, you'll notice they were all like 47, 48, which would have made them about like very early 20s at the time. So again, very early in their careers, and their discographies were pretty slim up to this point. I think like the second oldest member of the band had only appeared on 2 albums up to this point. So again, very, very fresh musicians. But with one exception, he did keep one person from the Mwandishi band, Benny Maupin. They were basically the same age, both born in about, I think, 1940 or so. And yeah, so Benny Maupin and Herbie Hancock were kind of like brothers. They were really tight, long-term collaborators. And I'm glad he kept Benny Maupin, because he really does something to this album, gives it this kind of mystical, experimental flair that they kept from Crossings. But the new musicians, you could tell they were very funk influenced. Let me get their names right here. So he got, so obviously Herbie Hancock on synthesizers, pianos, all the electronic instruments. He was just deep into at this point. And then Benny Maupin on the reeds. So like you got the sax, the alto, tenor saxophone, bass clarinet, alto flute, all those fucking wind instruments going on there. No trumpet though, just the reed instruments. And then we got, let me get this right, Harvey Mason on drums, Paul Jackson on bass guitar, excellent guitarist, Bill Summers, this guy is really the key to the album, on the percussion, the congas, all that stuff, giving it that African vibe. And yeah, I think that was the whole band. So it was a 5-piece band. Yeah, 5-piece band. Absolutely incredible. With the young blood infused with the old, with Herbie and Benny Maupin. And they proceeded to go into the studio and record this album, which, needless to say, became a huge, huge success for the band. The one thing they did keep from the Crossings era of the band, or the Mwandishi era of the band, if you want to call it that, were the long song structures. I mean, there's only 4 tracks on this entire album, ranging from 9 minutes at the shortest to 16 minutes at the longest, which is incredible. But, in contrast to the previous albums, rather than requiring that amount of time due to all the improvs and spacey jams, this one here required the long song lengths to really let these funky hypnotic grooves build and flourish and everything. So don't worry if you're afraid of constant time changes and weird improvs. This album really has none of that. Maybe a little bit on Sly, the song Sly, but overall the song lengths do not reflect the amount of time signature changes and crazy improvs contained within. So Don't be worried about the time length, the song lengths here. Again, the album was very accessible and commercially successful. Uh, and I guess the thing was, at the time, funk was really, gaining prominence. Bands, things like Stevie Wonder, Sly Stone, and James Brown were really big at this point. So it was no question why it sold. And here's the thing: when this album actually came out, it was released, a lot of the jazz critics and longtime jazz musicians were kind of disappointed by it. I mean, they were probably expecting another Crossings or another Sextant, which is the name of another album from that experimental era from Herbie. But they got this, and they were slightly disappointed by it. They considered it kind of a jazz pop or a sellout album. And yeah, the fans loved it, but and it turned on a whole new generation or audience onto jazz. But those old jazz musicians, they weren't really into it, which is probably a good sign, because when fusion came out in the late 60s, a lot of the old jazz musicians dismissed that as well. But then they later warmed up to it, and as we all know, the whole 1970s period was the jazz fusion era. I mean, just straightforward jazz had really kind of died out at that point, well, relatively speaking. So it's kind of a good thing that the old jazz critics didn't like it, but I think later on they turned around, and again, this album is widely regarded to be a masterpiece in jazz and jazz fusion in general, and really propelled Herbie Hancock's career. I mean, after this dude was playing stadiums and arenas and things like that, and he really made a huge name for himself with this album. There will be a couple follow-ups after with the Headhunters band, and the funny thing is, the Headhunters would actually go on to do things without Herbie Hancock. So what was originally started as a Herbie Hancock side project that he gave this name Headhunters to, eventually blossomed into something else. And again, I haven't heard anything by them yet, but I certainly have to. So this was really the big commercial breakthrough for Herbie. And it's funny because I feel like his career came full circle with this thing, with the song Watermelon Man, which originally appeared on his debut album, reappearing here, but with a completely different arrangement. So I really think that this album was kind of a round out of what he'd done before, and really the start to a new era for Herbie. So yeah, very interesting history behind it, and to this day, still one of the best-selling jazz albums. So for that reason alone, you got to listen to it. Now let's get into my overall review behind this thing, guys. All right, guys, so let's take a closer look at Headhunters and talk about the overall sound. Now, where should I start? I guess I should start by saying that yes, this is a jazz fusion album, but totally different from all the other jazz fusion albums at the time, because in its essence, this album here is a jazz funk jazz fusion album, if you want to put it that way, rather than the intense Jimi Hendrix style rock of Mahavishnu Orchestra fused with jazz and orchestration, or the more progressive synthesizer-based leanings of bands like Return to Forever, or Miles Davis's freeform kind of thing that he was doing at the time with Bitches Brew and Out on the Corner and things like that. This album here is a completely different beast. And again, at its core, it's a jazz funk album, which is interesting because funk in and of itself is kind of a fusion of a whole bunch of different genres. You got a strong R&B presence, you got soul, you even got elements of jazz just built into funk itself. But essentially, what funk is basically the rhythm section of the band being the star of the show. The bass, drums, and percussion really interlocking and creating these deceptively simple grooves that kind of cause this hypnotic feel that progresses throughout the entire track. And I say deceptively simple because sometimes the grooves that they create are really complex and interlocking, but to the ear it all sounds so hypnotic that it might sound a bit simplistic at first, but it's awesome because it creates this awesome hypnotic feel. And not hypnotic in the sense of what Herbie Hancock was doing before with these crazy soundscapes, hypnotic in the sense that you just lock into this groove and just forget the world around you. It doesn't change very much throughout in terms of like the baseline groove, but it just has a totally different atmosphere to it. It has a more bouncy, more playful kind of tone than the more intense stuff that the other jazz fusion bands were doing. So you gotta love that funk influence. And again, I mentioned the album kicks off right away with the track Chameleon, where jazz and funk are really on equal footing. But then as the album progresses, it gets more and more improvisational and jazzy. I don't even know if I pronounced that right. And really eases you into the whole jazz genre. But yeah, starting off, it's funk all the way. And with funk, you got to have a strong rhythm section. And this band is absolutely on fire. The bass playing is incredible. The drumming itself is amazing. But for me, the real star of the show is wait, let me get his name right. Bill Summers on the percussion with these Latino, African, Afro-Caribbean kind of sounds that he's creating that really run through a lot of the tracks on the album, giving it that, that world music kind of flair. And the interesting thing is, Herbie Hancock, he did experiment with all these African sounds on the percussion on his previous albums, but it took on a completely different atmosphere. There was more menacing and kind of disturbing. If you listen to songs like Water Torture and Sleeping Giants and things like that, those African drummings kind of give you the sense of dread and foreboding. But on this album, the African drumming just perfectly locks into the funky grooves and creates this amazing feel-good rhythm. And that's what I love about this album. It feels good. Like, you put it on and it just lifts your spirits up. It's joyful, it's playful, and you could tell the band was having a lot of fun with it, not trying to be heavy and intense like the previous few albums. So the rhythm section is absolutely incredible. And this rhythm section here really gives the foundation, the bedrock, for the two major soloists of the album. Obviously, Herbie Hancock on all his pianos and electric pianos and synthesizers and clavinets and just you name it, he plays it on the album. But not only him, but Benny Maupin. Holy shit, guys. His sax parts, his sax melodies, his sax solos, and, flute melodies, all those reed instruments are freaking amazing. And when he goes off into a solo, most notably on the song Sly, it's one of the highlights of the album. And it's just interesting because this guy here, he always, when he's playing, you're fucking listening. I mean, he has such command of his instruments. And the same thing went for his previous contributions on albums like Bitches Brew by Miles Davis. Whenever Benny Maupin would come in with a bass clarinet solo or something, it was always the highlight of the song. I mean, if you go back and listen to the song Spanish Key from that album, man, it's amazing. Like, the whole song is awesome, and Miles Davis's playing is incredible. But when you really listen to it, the standout moment is Benny Maupin's bass clarinet solo. And it's the same thing with this album. When he comes in, it's fantastic, and his playing is very improvisational and jazzy. But again, on top of that funky bedrock laid down by the rhythm section, it takes on a completely different atmosphere and just a more euphoric and feel-good kind of vibe. So yeah, I love how this album feels when you listen to it. And of course, at the end of the album, you get the slow-burning track, Vein Melter, which is kind of completely different than what came before it. And surprisingly, it still has the funk groove, but it's more expansive and symphonic and atmospheric, and probably the most similar to the previous albums, but still with that funky groove, it takes on a different kind of vibe and atmosphere. So yeah, absolutely incredible performances from all the members of the band. And Herbie Hancock, I mean, what's there to say about the guy? His performance on the album is absolutely incredible. It's his band, he's the star of the show, but it never feels like he's really showing off. Okay, maybe he has that one section in Chameleon where he's really showing off his synth skills, but he really lets the band come forward and put in their own ideas. And he's just an amazing player. I mean, you could tell at this point he had mastered all of the electric key instruments, and his synthesizer playing is great as well. It's jazzy, it's never overbearing, and it just, I don't know, it just feels like he has like this kind of restraint to his playing, where he isn't just going over the top at every millisecond. Kind of like in contrast to Chick Corea from Return to Forever, where when he's playing, like, damn, like, it's in your face. Like, his playing is way out there. Herbie Hancock, when he's soloing, again, with that one exception from Chameleon, it never feels like he's really overpowering the rest of the band, which I absolutely love about his playing. And another thing I like is that his playing in general is just so, it's fluid, but it has a lot of these sharp moments that kind of give it this guitar-sounding edge. Again, there's no guitar player in this band whatsoever. But with Herbie Hancock's keyboard playing at points, it has this rhythm to it, where it kind of feels like there's a rhythm guitarist in the background. But if you listen carefully, you realize, like, no, it's Herbie Hancock's synthesizer, which is really cool. And all the sounds he creates really range from vast symphonic soundscapes on the last track, Vein Melter, to, again, those funky grooves laid down on Chameleon. So really, really expansive sound, really diverse on the keyboards, and yeah, it's just, he's just incredible. Creates so many different moods and atmospheres, and yeah, his performance is just stellar on this album, as it always is on pretty much everything I've heard from the guy. And yeah, so the performances are just, again, second to none on this album. So don't be afraid if you've heard that this is a jazz pop album. The performances here are definitely virtuoso level, but the band isn't afraid to stay in one spot at at a time for an extended amount of time, which is really what contributes to the song lengths. I mean, if you listen to songs like Vein Melter, which is just this slow burning kind of track, and even Chameleon, where the first 3 minutes of the song is just this kind of groove, right? The band isn't afraid to stay in one spot at a time, and that's a good thing, I find. Because there's so many jazz fusion albums that, again, just go from place to place at the drop of a hat. Just an incredible amount of time signature changes and free form sections, like Bitches Brew, Crossings, Mahavishnu Orchestra's first two albums. Sometimes you just want to lock into a groove, and this is the album for you guys. This is the one where if you want to sit down and just get hypnotized, then listen to Headhunters, because it's really not going to demand too much from your ears, at least on side one, and it's just going to be a great time, an enjoyable time. Now, I will mention side two. Okay, we got Vein Melter, which is, again, that kind of closing track that doesn't really, not that it doesn't fit on the album, but it's the most distanced from the general sound. But then we got the track Sly, which is just this, it does have like a groove that gets repeated throughout the track, but this one here is really the most jazzy in terms of the instrumental improvisation. First with a Benny Maupin sax solo, and then with Herbie Hancock's piano solo there. So that one there, if you really love, things like Miles Davis and just jazz in general with the long stretches of improv solos, that's going to be the track for you. So again, there's something here for every single jazz fan. And I think that's what really makes it stand the test of time. So definitely one of the best albums ever. It's just perfect from start to finish. And just a very unique album with the funk, Afro-Caribbean vibes, and just the whole feel-good atmosphere of it. You can't go wrong with this one, guys. So now let's take a look at the album track by track. Alright guys, so kickstarting the album, we get the 16-minute long track Chameleon. And I really think that this song here is probably the most popular song over 15 minutes in length. Everyone knows this track. If you're into jazz, if you're into jazz fusion, this track here is one that, even if you don't know it's by Herbie Hancock, you've at least heard it before. It's one of the catchiest, most infectious, most accessible jazz fusion songs of all time. And today it's really considered to be a jazz standard. If you're learning jazz, if you're getting into the genre, this is one of the first tracks you should go to. Because again, it eases you in perfectly. It has all of those jazz elements, the solos, the improvs, but with that backdrop of funk. And boy, does this song fucking groove. I mean, the groove that this band lays down on this track is absolutely legendary. I don't think it can get groovier. I don't think it can get funkier. This is just the epitome of just a tasty, feel-good, grooving track. And 16 minutes in length. It really takes its time with the melodies, really lets things develop. And the playing is absolutely superb, especially at the 8-minute mark onward. Holy shit, guys, you're on cloud nine. It really is a song of two halves. The first half of the track is really just a funk jazz extravaganza with a Herbie Hancock, absolutely insane synthesizer solo on top of that. But the second half of the song is, for my money, it's the best part of the track. The whole man is just cooking on all levels. But nothing against the first half of the song. Just the second half is where I get extremely into it. The first half's amazing as well. Don't get me wrong. So this track here, it starts off with this very simple synth riff, very low-pitched with a nice bottom end. And get used to this synth riff, guys, because it goes through the entire first 8 minutes of the track with the dun-dun-dun-dun, dun-dun, dun-dun-dun-dun, dun-dun. And at first, you might think, like, oh, what is this? It kind of sounds simplistic. It doesn't really do much for you. But just wait, guys. Hold your horses. It gets insane because all the instruments join in at one point or another. And it just blends together in this amazing melting pot of funk. First the drums join in, and then when the bass comes in with this awesome groove just brewing under the surface, it starts coming together, guys, and by the 1 minute mark, you're absolutely grooving. I absolutely love Herbie Hancock's higher register synth playing, or I've even heard some sources say it's the bass. It's hard to really tell, kind of cutting underneath the surface. You still have the main synth riff going on in the background, but on top of that, you get these sharp kind of little like synth inflections there that give you the impression of a rhythm guitar, which I was talking about earlier. And I really think that was a nice touch. But then, really, all the pieces fall into place at the 1 minute, 30-second mark when the saxophone comes in. Benny Maupin's absolutely fantastic here. And he's really the missing piece of the puzzle. When that sax comes in, you're just grooving to the max. It's just so funky and such a melodic sax line. And it has an awesome swing to it as well, really bringing that jazz element to it. Absolutely incredible. And it goes on like that for about 3 minutes. But although it's repetitive, it doesn't feel like it. It just sucks you in. It's just so hypnotizing. And you just get lost in this amazing array of instruments. And really you could listen to this song a million times and it never gets old. Even though the first 3 minutes is literally just that funk beat repeated over and over again with the sax and everything. It's just I could listen to that for 10 minutes and I wouldn't mind. But before you know it, at the 3 minute mark, the sax kind of changes and it gets a little bit more climactic with the bam bam diddle down down, kind of like this crescendo. And you could tell things are going to start happening. And then before you know it, the sax finishes and we get an incredible 3 minute, almost 4 minute long Herbie Hancock synth solo. And this is the exception I was talking about earlier on when I said Herbie's playing doesn't really stand out where it really consumes all the other instruments. This is the one part of the album where it absolutely does, but in the best possible way. I mean, his synthesizer is just really out there on this section. Probably the hardest part of the track to get into if you're new to jazz fusion, because he's just creating these spacey psychedelic soundscapes all over the place. But again, with that funk groove in the background that never ends, by the way. For the first 8 minutes, it's just going straight. It really brings it down to earth and keeps it grounded in reality. So although the synth solo reaches for the stratosphere, the backbone of the track, that fucking rhythm section, is just really holding it down here. And it's just an absolutely incredible synth solo. Again, it might take you a couple listens to really get into, but once you do, you'll really appreciate the wacky out there tones that Herbie's employing on his synth here. Just one of the best synth solos ever, guys. And if you found it a little bit too overbearing, a little bit too piercing, don't worry too much, because we don't really have anything else like this on the album. It's just really this one section where Herbie's just letting loose, and then for the rest of the album, he kind of takes a back seat, relatively speaking. He's still there in the forefront, but not as in your face. So, and what I love about how the synth solo ends is that the sax comes in at the 7 minute 15 second mark, and the solo's still going, but you could tell a transition's coming. And then when that synth solo finally ends, that's when that funky groove that's been pulsating throughout the entire first 8 minutes of the track ends, and it finally kicks in. Like, holy shit, I've been listening to that for 8 minutes straight, and it hasn't gotten boring yet. But it ends, and here's where we get into the second half of the song, the part that really makes it what it is for me, guys. It's fantastic. We get this new bass groove coming in. It's just absolutely funky, and then the sharp guitar sounding synth kicks in as well, and before you know it, we get into one of the most atmospheric sections of the entire album. I love it. It just sounds absolutely lush with Herbie Hancock's fantastic keyboard and almost with like a Mellotron-sounding synth in the background. Very kind of symphonic and orchestral. And it's just beautiful, and it's just such a cool, laid-back section. You could just sit in a chair and just relax on a hot summer day, like today, kind of. And it just hits the spot, guys. And what I love about this section is that this is where we finally get those African drumming and percussion sections that I was telling you guys about. And it kind of just sneakily seeps into the music, but it really takes prominence. And I absolutely love the contrast between the African rhythms, the funky bass groove going on in the background, and Herbie Hancock's cool, jazzy piano solo at this point. It's just, oh man, absolutely great. It even sounds like string-like sections at points with the different effects Herbie has on the synthesizer. And before you know it, the sax comes back with that that we heard earlier on in the track, which really, at this point, kind of, whenever that comes in, it indicates that a transition is about to happen. It happened before Herbie's synth solo, and then it happened again before the new funky bass groove came in. But now it's happening again. But before you know it, we get this absolutely dreamy synth section at the 12-minute mark. Absolutely. Just, you're on cloud nine when you hear this, and then the piano grooves really hard here. The whole time you got these African tribal percussion polyrhythms going on in the background, and I love how his piano playing alternates with that dreamy string style synthesizer that comes in. It just goes back and forth, and oh man, it's just great. That part there is a huge highlight for me. Then before you know it, again that sax riff that indicates a transition comes in, and we do get a transition, but back to that original dun 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 dun. And then when that comes in, you realize how long this track is, because it almost seems like a distant memory at this point. But rather than just getting back into the main groove of the track, we get this awesome sax solo closing out the track. Really, Benny Maupin just takes center stage here. But the solo is just, it's so cool, it's so laid back, and it never really goes into the stratosphere like Herbie Hancock's synth solo. So just a nice, very down-to-earth sax section there that kind of fades out the track, again, with the opening funky groove in the background. Just absolutely love the second half of this track. Love the first half as well. But overall, it's a masterpiece. It's easily a 10 out of 10. Like, you can't give Chameleon anything less than a 10 out of 10. And yeah, the song really shows that these guys, they really have it all. And, you know, they're willing to juxtapose these funky, down-to-earth grooves with these more spacey, atmospheric, and just frankly beautiful sections. So, just masterpiece. Next off, we got Watermelon Man, an absolute amazing song, an absolute classic, and just one of those instantly recognizable songs. Again, this song here was actually written for Herbie's debut album, which was called Taken Off, and on that album, it was a pretty big hit, a pretty successful track. It had this nice, cool jazz atmosphere to it, a great melody to boot. But on this album, they took that song from the vaults, totally changed the arrangement, and out came the definitive version of Watermelon Man. I'm sure we can all agree that this version here is the most celebrated and the most memorable. And it's just such a unique song. It has this African jungle kind of feel to it, and it's just second to none. And again, in the middle of the track, the meat and potatoes of the song is kind of that original melody from 1962 from his debut album. But bookending the track, we get this absolutely iconic introduction and closing of the song, which just evokes all this imagery of just being lost in an African jungle. And it's just, again, it's just instantly recognizable. It kicks off with this weird, organic sounding, hollow kind of tune. And it's so weird. It almost has like this human quality to it. It's honestly unlike anything you've ever heard in your life, and it just instantly grabs your attention. And later on, I couldn't believe this when I read up on it, but apparently it was the band's percussionist blowing on a beer bottle, creating that hypnotic melody with the doo 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 doo. And I can't believe you can create something so iconic just using a simple beer bottle. It blows my mind every single time. But again, it tells you that the level of musicianship we're dealing with here, guys. These guys are just second to none, in a class of their own. Then before you know it, we get all these African yells and shouts in the background, and the flute comes in, and it just creates this jungle-like atmosphere, which is freaking phenomenal. Then before you know it, the funky bass line kicks in, and what a bass line it is. Just so cool and laid back. And then the drums kick in, and it's just this almost cacophony of African tribal sounding amazingness. And the funny thing is, we don't have any of the percussion going on there. It's really just driven by the flute, the beer bottle, and the drums, and obviously the bass line as well. But yeah, you would expect the African congas to come in, but no, they're not there. And but then before you know it, that kind of fades out, and we get into kind of the meat and potatoes of the song, the incredible melody that Herbie Hancock came up with back in '62. And this part of the song here is really cool. We get that rhythm guitar-like synthesizer coming in just as the background fades out, just as the intro kind of fades out. And then the sax and piano take over. Or I've heard people say this is actually the alto flute. So it might be the alto flute, but really this section of the track, Herbie Hancock really lets the bass playing and the sax / flute, whatever it is, really take prominence. And it has this cool kind of just laid back feel, but with awesome melodies. It has like a playful vibe to it, and it's just great. It's so smooth. The piano really, it kicks in and adds like these little flourishes and these little climaxes here and there, but really it's all about the bass and the sax. Absolutely incredible. Then right when you're getting into it, I think at around the 5-minute mark, the beer bottle melody comes back in, and the whole track just kind of finishes off where it starts, right into the heart of Africa. And again, it's just such an incredible conclusion. But, you know, don't get me wrong. The middle section where the sax and bass groove really takes prominence there, it's an awesome melody as well. But it's just completely overshadowed by the introduction and the conclusion. I guess, I don't even know if you can call it an introduction, because it does last 2 minutes, and the whole track's only like 6.5 minutes. So really it is kind of just the first major section of the song. But it's unlike anything you've ever heard in your life. And again, with the jazzy bit in the middle, it's going to please a lot of the jazz purists. Because, again, it's a melody from 1962, so you can't complain. That was in the heat of the pure jazz movement. So Watermelon Man, absolutely classic, iconic song. I would easily give it a 10 out of 10 just for the intro alone. But looking at the song overall, the whole middle section there, it's great and everything, but it's not 10 out of 10 status. Maybe it's like 9.5. So overall, I'm going to give the track a very, very strong 9.5 out of 10. And it's just another masterpiece, guys. All right, guys. So now we flip the album over, and we were just getting our feet wet with side one because side two really delves into the jazz, and this is again for the millionth time the side of the album where they're really gonna start getting a little bit crazy. So demands a little bit more of your attention, a little bit more, maybe a few more listens to let it sink in, but it's absolutely fantastic. And they start this off with the track Sly, the 10-minute song opening up side two, named after Sly from Sly and the Family Stone, who was a major inspiration of the band. This track here really kicks the intensity up. The first two tracks, for the most part, were pretty laid back, pretty groovy, pretty atmospheric. This song here just really ups the ante and creates one of the more intense improvisational style songs. And really, the song has a fantastic melody, but this track here is really the gateway for Benny Maupin and Herbie Hancock to shine with two incredible 3-minute solos on the sax and piano, respectively. It's just absolutely incredible. But really, for me, the star of the show, other than those two soloists, is the fantastic percussion in the background. The rhythm section is on absolute fire on this song. It's almost like this samba kind of Latino kind of polyrhythm going on in the background, and the African percussion is absolutely incredible and really drives the song forward. But really, the main melody of the song is amazing as well. It opens up with this sharp kind of sax that alternates with the piano with this Bennett, and then do 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 Bennett, it's this great melody. It kind of has like a nice swing to it. And then we get into one of my favorite melodies of the track, where we get into this absolutely dreamy sax and flute kind of unison. I don't know, it sounds like someone's playing the sax and someone else is playing the flute at the same time, but it must have been like studio trickery going on there. And it creates this absolutely dreamy kind of beautiful unison. And the African percussion comes in during this section. It's a little bit, this part here is a little bit slower paced, but before you know it, the song kind of comes crashing to an end, and you don't really know what's going to happen. The song goes full stop, and then at the 1 minute, I think at the 2-minute mark or so, this is when all hell breaks loose with the rhythm section absolutely set on fire, just playing just so frantically, and this is where Benny Maupin comes in with one of my all-time favorite sax solos that I've heard so far. It lasts so long. It's about 3 minutes in length, and it's really free form, really kind of really improvisational. Of course, it's jazz, so what do you expect? But this is really the first moment on the album where we get into a straightforward jazz improv solo. But again, with that percussion going nuts in the background and the amazing grooves laid down. And again, the percussion backdrop here is just so strong that it's easy to get lost in that and forget there's a sax solo even happening at the same time. Because it's just, again, that backdrop, that percussion is just so intense that it really calls for your full attention. But with Benny Maupin's amazing sax solo over, you're kind of divided on what to focus on. And I love when jazz does that. I love when jazz gives you, a challenging listen where, you want to focus on one thing, but there's always something else going on that also demands your attention. Again, that just might be me being new to jazz, but I don't know, it creates for a really immersive listening experience. That's the word I want to use. And yeah, Benny Maupin's solo is fantastic here. He's absolutely screaming on the sax. And again, it goes on for 3 minutes, but it never feels over long. Then before you know it, the whole thing comes crashing to an end. We get the blaring sax. And again, the song just stops for a second. But then before you know it, the samba vibe just kicks back in immediately. And we go off into a 3-minute Herbie Hancock piano solo. And one thing I should mention before I get into his electric piano solo, is that during this entire section, Herbie Hancock's rhythm guitar-like sounding synth is going on in the background, just perfectly blending in with that samba rapid-fire percussion background, really giving it that bottom end there. You gotta love Herbie's playing here. It's just, who needs a guitar player? Who needs a rhythm guitar player when you got Herbie Hancock? And yeah, then we get into his solo, and it's nothing like what he was doing on the album up to this point. This solo here is very, I don't want to say free form because it's not really free form, but you know what I mean. It's a lot looser, a lot more experimental, a lot more avant-garde compared to the more structured solos he was doing on the previous tracks. or solo, I should say. But yeah, it's fantastic, and it just blends in the background with the rhythm section, so less of a jarring experience than Benny Maupin's sax solo with the same rhythm section. This one here just all kind of blends into one amazing brew, and it's just a great piano solo. I don't know what else to say about it. Very climactic. It climaxes multiple times, but then it just keeps going and going and going, and it's exhausting in the best possible way. But then the song finally ends and wraps things up with some of the original themes that were happening at the beginning, with the dreamlike sax and flute unison, as well as the I don't know how else to describe it because I'm no jazz musician, and it's challenging to describe jazz music, by the way. I'm just giving you guys my initial impressions of it, basically, from a non-music theory background. Hopefully it comes across as okay. But anyway, guys, not to get off on a tangent, but Sly is just a fantastic song. And yeah, really just the fastest and most intense track on the album. So if that's your kind of style, you're going to absolutely love this track. And a really good contrast to the next song on the album, which we're going to get into at length, but the complete opposite. Just a slow burning atmospheric dreamscape. So without further ado, let's get on to the next track. Now, closing out the album, guys, we got a really, really special song, Vein Melter. Now, from the title alone, this song is not what you think it is. It sounds absolutely insane, like some fucking death metal band or something like that. But let me tell you guys, this song is as far away from death metal as you can get, and pretty much as far away from the rest of the album as you can get. Vein Melter is just this 10-minute atmospheric piece of music that just, every single time I listen to it, it gets better and better and better. It's a slow-burning song that really just revolves around this repetitive melody and just the sparse soundscapes created by Herbie Hancock's amazing, often orchestral-sounding synthesizer, and Benny Maupin's amazing bass clarinet or saxophone, whichever one it is, you know what I mean. And together, they just create a masterclass in slow-burning, atmospheric music that ranges from absolutely intense and intense in a dark kind of way, not a fast kind of way like the song preceding it, to just absolutely gorgeous, sunny, and warm. And upon further analysis of the song title, I quickly realized that Vein Melter must be referring to heroin use, which was very prevalent in the jazz community in the 50s. And I don't think Herbie Hancock took part in any of that shit. But maybe this track here is just trying to evoke maybe what it feels like to do heroin, because it's a very warm kind of sounding song, but it does get very sinister at points as well, just showing the dark side of heroin use. Again, that's just my interpretation of it, but either way, whatever you interpret this song as, it's the perfect song to listen to at nighttime. When I first heard this album, it was kind of evening or late afternoon, I can't really remember, and out of all the tracks on the album, this one here didn't really stand out to me. And my friend said, don't worry, Rocco, if you give it a few more listens, it really grows on you, it really becomes something special. So I took his advice, and he was absolutely right, because I listened to this album again that night, and Vein Melter took on a completely different feel, completely different atmosphere. It's just a very dark and brooding song, but again, with very melodic and sunny moments, adding little touches of color here and there. It's just a masterclass of music. And again, if you're not into the whole atmospheric kind of thing, to be honest, this song might not be your style. Even after repeated listens, it might not do much for you. But I love when progressive rock bands and jazz fusion bands go off and do these amazing soundscapes. And this one here is among the Premier League. I mean, this is one of the absolute best. And for me, it never gets boring. It never feels overlong, although it is a very slow-paced, slow-burning tune. But it's fantastic. Now, one thing it does have in common with the rest of the album is it does have some elements of funk. It starts off with this very funky but very, very slow tempo bass groove with the doom 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 doom, and it's just really it's really strange. It's unaccompanied. Then before you know it, we got Benny Maupin kind of reprising that with his sax or bass clarinet, and it creates this very dark, dusky atmosphere. But then before you know it, it locks into the main groove of the song, which, like Chameleon, kind of just runs through the entire thing with the da-na, 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 and then over that, Benny Maupin comes in with a beautiful, again, bass clarinet solo or section there, just playing these very sparse notes, very mournful, very melancholic, and almost haunting. And the drumming in the background kind of has this marching band style to it, which is kind of strange. And man, it's just amazing. But then before you know it, Herbie Hancock comes in with this string sounding synthesizer section that just swells up, and it's just absolutely beautiful. It's just a moment of beauty in this dark, melancholic track. And Herbie Hancock, by the way, he's playing the electric piano throughout the entire thing, but very sparse notes. But when he comes in with his synthesizer, just with that string section there, it just swells up to the max. It's just a beautiful, sunny moment on the track. Again, highlighting the warm feeling you probably get when you do heroin. Don't do heroin, by the way. I'm not promoting that in any way. Don't get this wrong. But it's beautiful, and it's kind of like streams of sunlight bursting through the clouds when that comes in. It's absolutely great. Later on in the track, the song does switch focus from the bass clarinet more to the piano playing, and the slow groove really kicks in there. And but there's this really ominous section that I want to highlight at the 6-minute mark, where again we get the orchestral symphonic sounding piano / synth playing from Herbie Hancock. But here it sounds absolutely sinister and just really, really dizzying when you listen to it. Very disorienting. But I absolutely love that. And overall, it's just such an atmospheric song. There's not much more I could say to describe it, but a beautiful piece of music. Honestly, I want to give it a 10 out of 10. Today I'm feeling a 9.5, but some days I give it a 10 out of 10. It's just an absolute highlight on the album, and don't let the slow pace fool you. The playing on this song is absolutely phenomenal. But it might be a track that you have to listen to a couple times to fully grasp and fully envelop you. But let me tell you guys, when it does, it surrounds you like a warm blanket of comfort. And at other times, a very cold blanket with the more sinister sections of the track. Perfect song to listen to at night. Just go outside, take a nice 10-minute walk around the block, and on a hot, clear summer night. And let me tell you guys, there's nothing else quite like it. It is quite an experience. So phenomenal track right there. And that closes out the album, guys. So again, we see the contrast between side 1 and side 2. With Watermelon Man and Chameleon, we had a lot more conventional music, a lot more structured. But when we go on to side 2, it retains the funky grooves, but throws in a lot of improv and a lot of experimental, atmospheric stuff. And I'd say if you really like Vein Melter, then definitely go back and check out the earlier Herbie Hancock albums. Again, I mentioned the album Crossings. There's a track on that called Water Torture. I know, amazing song title, by the way. And that's probably the closest you're going to get to Vein Melter. That one there, I got to warn you guys, it's a lot more experimental, a lot more free form, but it retains kind of the same atmosphere as Vein Melter at points. So if you enjoy that, definitely go back. If you don't, and it's by far the worst song on the album for you, then maybe stay clear of the earlier stuff. For now, at least, always try to go back and listen to it. But apparently, coming forward, there are a lot of great Herbie Hancock and Headhunters albums that I'm just waiting to discover. So definitely this weekend, I'm going to try to check out the sequel to this one called Thrust, which apparently is also well received. And I absolutely can't wait, because if it's anywhere near as good as this album, it's going to be another masterpiece. So thank you so much for indulging me, guys. I really had a good time talking about this album. Again, let me know what you think about how I talk about jazz music, because I'm not a musician, and I know it's hard to discuss jazz without getting into music theory and everything. I'm just telling you guys my personal opinions, what I feel when I listen to the music, and kind of like the big highlights of the track. So if you like that format, let me know. If you think I suck, then also let me know. I could take the constructive criticism, but hopefully I don't, because I want to keep reviewing jazz fusion albums. But anyway, let me know down below. I appreciate all your advice. And as always, if you have any recommendations, leave them down below as well. Might not get to it, in a timely fashion, but I'll definitely put it down on my to listen to list. So thank you so much, guys. Take care and rock on.